Please welcome Josh Kerbel.
Okay, this is working. Yes, I am not a spy, and I'm sorry. This is what we look like, right? We don't look like Daniel Craig, and we don't look like Matt Damon. We just look like normal people, and for the most part, we are. I want to just say quickly a quick thanks to SAP and to Quantalia, to Lorianne for putting this on. I think this is just a great event and really timely event for us right now. I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of contextualizing the need, and I'm going to give you a view from the intelligence community. Before I do that, I should probably contextualize this term, the intelligence community, and a little bit about myself. First of all, just for those of you who don't know, we throw this term around, intelligence community. It may not have a lot of meaning to some of you. The intelligence community in the United States exists of 17 agencies spread. It's a worldwide presence. Some of them are very large and very well known, like CIA, where I used to work. Some of them are much smaller comparatively and less well known, like INR, the State Department, or Department of Treasury Intelligence, or Department of Energy Intelligence, and others. But overall, it's a large global organization. And the National Intelligence University is that organization's actual university. It is a real university. It is fully accredited, as you heard. It grants degrees. It resides on a beautiful campus in Bethesda, Maryland, right outside of Washington. And the whole idea behind it is to create better intelligence officers and to create a better intelligence apparatus. It's maybe hard to believe, but actually a lot of the things that we use and do in the intelligence community, you're just not going to learn in a regular university. There are no terminal degrees in intelligence or intelligence analysis. And that is what we do at NIU. A little bit about me. I've only been at National Intelligence University for about 2 years. I've been in the intelligence community for 23. And I've covered a lot of agencies in that time. I've spent time as an actual employee, not on loan, but as an actual employee of the Office of Naval Intelligence, of the Central Intelligence Agency, of the National Intelligence Council, of the intelligence component of the Navy staff and the Pentagon. What else? The NIC, the National Intelligence Council, and the Defense Intelligence Agency. For 5 years, I was the chief methodologist there. And if my colleagues sometimes joke that my resume suggests, yes, that I have a pretty broad perspective on the IC, but it also suggests that I have a hard time holding a job. And there is some real truth to that. I should say, I've never been fired, although that actually does happen much more often in both in the intelligence community and the US government than people seem to realize. But I have had it made abundantly clear to me over time that no one would really be particularly concerned were I to move on, and as they euphemistically put it, seek opportunities elsewhere. And I have done that over time, and I think you'll see why that's the case in the course of the talk that I'm going to give here. That requires me at this point to say here at the end, the title of my talk says A View from the Intelligence Community. I have to emphasize that this is a view. And this is where I'm obligated to put in the necessary disclaimer that all the views that I present here today are mine alone, and they should not be construed to be the opinions of the US government, the National Intelligence University, the Department of Defense, or any other component thereof. Okay, that said, let me dig a little bit into this in a broad conceptual way. And I want to start off by making just a couple of propositions or a couple of observations that I was thinking about before I came here after Lorianne invited me. Number one, I want to point out, or make the observation that the challenges of the intelligence community are really not that unique to the intelligence community. Everything that I'm going to talk about here that are our challenges are your challenges as well. So I think a lot of times people tend to think that the intelligence community is this really unique kind of place, and it's very special what happens there, but I'm going to be talking about things, and this is where I think the lessons overlap and are transmittable, is that everything that I'm talking about here today, I think, are your challenges as well. Number two, I want to make the observation that I think that the tech community, in a lot of ways, simply does not understand us. It does not really understand a lot of the time what we do, particularly analytically. I think you might more on the collection side. I don't really have anything to do with the collection side. But just in my experience of watching vendors over time come into the intelligence community, and I do this a lot, I get invited to sort of get the demos of things that people are pitching to us to see how they were going to fit and whether they're worth us buying. There seems to be sort of a disconnect. And it's not all the tech community's fault, maybe even not a lot the tech community's fault, because we tend to play our cards pretty close to our chest. It's pretty hard for you to know what we need if we're not really good at saying what we need. And I think that that's part of the problem that has to be addressed. And the flip side of this is that the intelligence community itself, I think, doesn't have a really great understanding of the tech community. So what ends up happening a lot of the time, again, mostly from an analytical perspective, is technologies and tools come into the community, and analysts either don't understand them, they don't understand what they're supposed to do for them, and therefore ignore them, simply do not use them, or if they do use them, they often shoehorn them into their existing business practices. So whereas this may be a technology that allows them actually to do something quite different, and the circumstances might require something different, what they instead end up doing is saying, how can I use this to do what I'm already doing, just maybe to do it a little bit better? So we lose, I think, a lot on those grounds. So what I really wanted to do here in the time that I have is I wanted to try and bring those three perspectives together in some way, maybe to sync them up in some way that will be useful to you in particular, but to anybody else, because I give this talk a lot within the IC, and maybe it will be helpful to bring these communities together. I wanted to start in doing that by giving you a quick sort of history of the intelligence community. It's 70 years of history. I'm going to cover it in just a few short minutes, but I think it's important for understanding kind of who we are and where we come from. I gave you the names of some of the organizations and some sense of us, but you sort of have to understand the arc of our experience as to why we are the way we are. The intelligence community has a real start date, 1947 with the National Security Act. Obviously, intelligence goes as a discipline is something that goes back to the founding of the Republic. George Washington is often referred to as the first spy master. But we didn't start talking about a community until 1947. That's when that language becomes prevalent with the National Security Act. And the National Security Act did a lot to sort of set us up for this Cold War environment post-World War II that we were going to be dealing with. And it did a number of things. Obviously, it created a Defense Department by merging the War and Navy departments. It created an independent Air Force by breaking that off from the Army. And in the realm of intelligence, it created the Central Intelligence Agency. And that central in CIA stands for central to this community. That's what we were referring to. And the community that we were creating had a very distinct and already identified problem in mind, right? And I'm referring here, of course, to the Soviet Union, right? We were aware that by 1947, they had been our ally, but certainly not particularly our good friend, and they were going to be a problem for us in the post-Cold War world, and in the post-World War II world. And we were creating a system of government and organization that was going to allow us to deal with that, a national security apparatus. And the Soviet Union had a couple of characteristics about it that fundamentally shaped the intelligence community. And my argument would be that those characteristics are still shaping us even today at a time when the Soviet Union has been gone for 30 years. So what were those characteristics? Well, number one, the Soviet Union was a closed system. And that meant if you wanted to know what was going on inside of it, you needed classified collection. So we are first and foremost a classified collection community, right? That's what we're built around. The analysts in our community are second-class citizens, even today, right? Because the notion always was you didn't have anything to analyze if that collection system didn't do its job. That's really all I'm going to say about that. The second characteristic of the Soviet Union was that it was a hierarchy, right? That as you went down through the ranks below the Kremlin, there was less and less horizontal knowledge, right? And you had if you wanted to know and you could understand the Soviet Union, you really could by understanding those top-down flows, and particularly the top, right? So we had this whole notion of the field of Kremlinology, right? We were always trying to study the Kremlin to see what exactly it would do. And I think that the historical record suggests, no matter what you may have heard, or even some of what you may have read, is that the intelligence community did a pretty good job with regard to the Soviet Union. Certainly we had our failures, and certainly we struggled more sometimes with the behavior of the Soviet Union. But in terms of a granular knowledge of its capabilities, what it was capable of, what it was inclined to, what its red lines were, I think we had a pretty good knowledge. I think in turn they had a pretty good knowledge of us. But the fact of the matter is that I think the literature would suggest, and I think the history suggests, that you can argue that the intelligence community played a really constructive role in helping to usher the Cold War and the Soviet Union into a peaceful grave. All good and fine. And that works just fine for us for a certain period of time, right? Now, right till about 1989 to 1992. And then in 1989 to 1992, all of a sudden the world takes a fundamental change on us, right? So what happens in 1989? Well, certainly in Europe, the Berlin Wall comes down. This is one of the things I love talking about the intelligence community audiences now, because I ask them, how many of you were alive when this happened? And I get almost no hands go up, right? This is how young we are. We have just a huge number of people coming in. There's plenty of people that I'm talking to who are more welcoming of this message. It's the older generation. It still exists, but that is not necessarily as receptive. But so in 1989, the Berlin Wall comes down and everything behind it starts to connect with itself and connect with the outside world. And then in 91, the Soviet Union itself implodes. And everything within the former Soviet Union begins to connect with itself. I talked about how it was a hierarchy. It starts to become much more networked, right, and connect with the outside world. So that we have the biggest landmass, this biggest chunk of land, right, that had been disconnected from the rest of the world, partly by the American policy of containment and partly by Soviet paranoia. This is now starting to connect with itself and connect outside. Right? And then in 1989, you swivel a little bit to the east and to the south, and you have what happens in China, right? You have Tiananmen Square, which we're just celebrating the anniversary of, right? So in China, you have the largest mass of people, the largest chunk of population that had, for the most part, been mostly isolated, right? You'd had a slow opening. I'm a China analyst by background. You'd had a slow opening in the 1980s in China, but in 89, you get the Tiananmen protests, put down violently. Government is convinced that these students have been contaminated by outside ideals, and obviously you could see why they would come to that conclusion in the sense that they erected a statue in Tiananmen Square called the Goddess of Liberty, obviously modeled on the Statue of Liberty. So the Chinese government puts a hard squash on that opening, and that continues till about 1992, when Deng Xiaoping, the de facto leader, he goes on what's called the Southern Tour, and then he announces that China needs to open up, and it needs to open up rapidly. And from that time on, we see this massive, rapid opening of China, sort of one of the most amazing geopolitical, geostrategic, geoeconomic, you say it, events of all time in terms of watching what is happening there as China becomes completely enmeshed into the world, right? And during this period of this opening, this is when you start to hear the language of globalization, which is really just a way of saying increasing complexity, right? Which is about interdependence and interconnectivity. And then you have the third thing that aids and abets this process. That sort of just, that opening takes it and just puts it on steroids, right? And that, of course, is the information technology revolution, where we now have people who at one time were just completely disconnected who are now fully connected. And I like to, if you go on the internet, you'll find there's this great photograph that I use sometimes when I use slides. I don't like to use slides usually, but there's a great photograph of in China. In northern China, they eat wheat, and then they grow wheat and eat noodles. And in southern China, they grow rice. And there's this great photograph you can find. It's out there, easily found. And it's a picture of a Chinese farmer, an older gentleman, and he's on a water wheel. They put water through the rice paddies by turning water wheels, right? Sometimes it's done by animals, sometimes it's done by people pedaling, right? The Chinese have been doing this for millennia. Right? And it's a picture of a Chinese farmer in his short pants and in bare feet somewhere in Sichuan province. And he's on the water wheel and he's pedaling, right? This photograph, if photography had existed, could have been taken 1,000 years ago, right? There's just something that gives it away, right? And you can probably imagine what that something is he's on his phone, right? He's talking on his phone. Here's a gentleman who 35 years ago wouldn't have known what was going on in the next province or maybe even in the next village, right? And now not only does he have the ability to hear what's going on, he has the actual ability to share with what's going on with the tap of his finger, right? This is a totally different information environment that we're living in. So if I were to put it in a sum across the board, that period from 1947 to 1989, 92 is what we might term a complicated period, right? It was a period of we were dealing with a closed system, a hierarchical system, a two-body problem, right? The Cold War was very essentially a two-body problem. Two-body problems are very linear in their behavior. They respond to each other, right? Very mechanistic. You can think about them as machines. To very rapidly transitioning from that to what we would term a complex problem, right? A problem that is now an open system that is not hierarchical, but that is networked, right? And very dynamic and constantly changing, and that does not behave like a machine, but behaves like an organism, right? It's an organic kind of a problem. And this has all kinds of implications for the intelligence community, as I said, and probably for you as well, because this is a very different way. You have to think very differently to understand this kind of a problem. And I want to give you an example of something that I was privy to just a couple of years ago as sort of an illustration that I think it'll drive it home in the national security context. A couple of years ago, we had a senior defense leader in the Defense Department at a high level, and he expressed some degree of disappointment with the national level intelligence briefing that he was receiving each week. Depending on your positions and so forth, you can get them at different times. He was a receiver of it weekly. And he expressed this concern, and the intelligence community sent a small delegation to go and see him and find out, you know, where was his disappointment coming from. And we were ushered into his conference room and sitting at his table, and he comes bounding in, and he has this one wall that is just one giant whiteboard. And he takes this dry erase marker and he walks along the whiteboard making little dots. And he walks the whole length and he says, making little dots, and he says, that whiteboard is my area of responsibility. Okay, that's what we refer to as an AOR. That's my area of responsibility. And those little black dots are what you in the intelligence community know. And he says to us, now every time I tell you, meaning the intelligence community, that I have to understand that entire whiteboard, right, because it's all interconnected, you say to me, sir, tell us what you need to know, and we'll go collect it. And he looks at us and he says, wrong. He says, even if I knew what I needed to know, and I don't know what to ask necessarily, and even if you were able to collect it, and you can't, that whiteboard remains 99% white. And this is the problem that we're having here. You in the intelligence community, you think that this is a collection problem, right? That you're going to go and just find the answers. We'll ask the questions and we'll find the answers by collecting them. And it's not. It's a cognition problem. It's a thinking problem. Until you start to think of it in these terms and understand that you can only address it by addressing your cognition issues. Cognition, I don't even know if that's a word, but I just made it. I do that often. We're going to have this problem, and you're not going to be of particular help to me. And that's really what I wanted to spend the bulk of my time talking about. I wanted to talk a little bit about cognition, and I wanted to talk about what it means to be able to think effectively about this new interconnected environment that we live in, right? It's a very different kind of, the information environment is different in the sense that so much of it is open source, right? There's just so much out there in the open. Whereas that old world of the Soviet Union we lived in was a world where we never had enough information. We always wanted more and more and more. The world we're living in now is a world where we're drowning in information, right? A lot of it good. You'll hear a lot of people say, "Oh, well, you know, you got to be really careful about the open source information. It's not, it could be manipulated. It could be, and that's true. But you have to be that way about classified information as well, right? And you're all familiar with the story of what happened in Iraq and everything, so I don't have to underline that point. But the fact of the matter is we're an entirely different information environment, and we need to think about it. So what I want to talk about here is this notion of what we talk about in the intelligence community as analysis. We call our thinkers, we call them analysts, right? And the word analysis comes from the Greek, and it means to break down. It means to attack problems by breaking them down into smaller pieces. Which is essentially what we do. So it's a really apt term for us. We're analysts, right? We break it down, right? Because we've been trained as Americans and have brought up most of us through the American educational system. We've been trained to think in analytic terms. This is something that has been emphasized in us since we were children, right? And by that I mean the rules of linearity are ingrained in us very, very deeply. If you were educated in the United States, or actually even in the West most likely, these rules are very deeply ingrained in you as well, right? Rule number 1, the whole is equal to the sum of its parts, right? This is the rule that allows us to analyze things. So this is the fundamental rule. This is the rule that says I can understand the pieces, and then I can put the pieces together, and I will understand the whole, okay? Rule number 2, there's identifiable cause and effect. And if I can't see it beforehand, I'll certainly see it in retrospect. Okay, so that's the second rule. Rule number 3, the system is repeatable, right? Which means the way it's behaved in the past and the way it's behaving now is likely to be the way it behaves into the future. And if it deviates, it's likely to deviate incrementally. So if you were to map it over time on a graph, you would get linear or curvilinear lines, smooth lines. Right? We almost never ever say the system is going to go into a more chaotic state in a period, right? So we don't say that. We extrapolate into the future. And then there's the last rule, which of course is the rule of proportional input-output. A little bit of an input in the system gets you a little bit of an output. A lot of an input gets you a lot of an output, right? Think of the brake pedal in your car. You tap on it, you slow a little. You slam on it, you slow a lot. Same thing with the accelerator, right? Car is a great example of a linear creature. These rules are wonderful rules when you're dealing with complicated linear systems, right? These rules served us pretty well for thinking about a problem like the Soviet Union. These rules are terrible for thinking about complex problems. If you apply these rules to thinking about problems that are highly complex, you are setting yourself up for failure. And that's just a bottom line. Right? And these rules are built into so much of what we do, right? So analysts, these are the rules that they often apply, right? Even when dealing with complexity.
Could you walk through those 4 rules one more time?
Sure. Rule number 1, the whole is equal to the sum of its parts. Okay, rule number 2, there's identifiable cause and effect. Often before, but certainly in retrospect. Rule number 3, the system is repeatable. If it changes, it'll change incrementally. And rule number 4, there's proportional input-output, proportionality. Sure. Those rules are wonderful, again, for thinking about complicated mechanical systems. They're terrible rules for thinking about complex systems. And this is the place where we find ourselves, and this is actually one of these places where I think that the potential for AI and DI, and again, I'm not a tech expert, but I would sense there's amazing applicability here to be able perhaps to help us think about these, because in order to think about complexity, you have to think about it almost the opposite of analytically. You have to think about it synthetically. You have to put things together. And this is very hard for a human being in the sense that there's so many parameters or so many issues, right, that it becomes overwhelming very quickly. Now, there's a few things that we can do just as people to help us, but then I would argue that perhaps the technology can help us as well. Number 1 is visualization, right? So in the intelligence community, we tend to be a prose-based community, right? We tend to communicate and talk in words. I won't even go into how simple we often tend to, and a typical intelligence product often tends to be. But we tend to be a prose-based community. Visualization is not that much a part of what we do. Now, there is a requirement now. We have what are called analytic standards that require us to include visuals. But usually what analysts do is they look at these, think about visuals at the end, right? So they've written a paper, and now they say, okay, now I need a visual to enhance what I've just written, right? So I need a picture of Putin, like I don't know what he looks like, or whatever it may be, or a map or a graph, but usually some kind of a visual after the fact. But I'm talking about using visualization to help you think about the problem. And this is something that is not readily done. Now, there's software that can help with this, but it doesn't even have to be software. It can be very low tech, right? It can be dry erase markers and butcher block paper and sticky notes to sort of create diagrams. But there's software like Loopy and other things as well that can help you do this. But this is something that analysts are just really beginning to come to grips with. In fact, one of my favorite things to do with analytic training classes is to compel analysts to take 15 minutes and to draw me a picture of their problem, of what it is they're dealing with. Almost 90% of the time, I will get a bunch of arms crossed and saying, well, this is ridiculous. I deal in words, right? I deal in language. I haven't drawn a picture since 5th grade, right? And that's not serious. But that's the world that it is serious now. You have to be able to create a picture of your problem if it's a complex problem. And if you can't, then you have to, that's your beginning point. Trying to describe a complex problem in words is almost impossible. It gets very quickly into tons of words, and it just a huge amount of digression would be necessary, stuff that's just not simply allowed in the intelligence community. We just simply don't have time and the belief that policymakers aren't going to read it, which may be true. Therefore, visualization is just a crucial tool to doing this well. And I think visual is another area where AI and DI can potentially come into play to support us in supporting us, to help us learn to think really what is synthetically, but some people term it creatively, right? Because we're talking about putting things together and thinking about possibilities. Because complex systems, unlike complicated systems where you often know the question and you can also ask yourself and come to an answer, complex systems only have possibilities, right? A lot of the times what the best you're going to do with a complex system is just come to a better question. There's a huge amount of uncertainty involved there and a willingness to accept that uncertainty. And it's not an easy sell, right? Particularly in a community that has long seen itself as, the place that you went to for the answers. So you get into an entire sense, it's an entire kind of personality kind of crisis, like who are we and what are we doing and what is our job in this new world? And what you end up with is you end up with what the business community would call sustaining innovation. Actually, the intelligence community is pretty innovative, right? But it's innovative in the sense of sustaining innovation, in the sense that it often looks at what it's doing and it just wants to do more, better, stronger, faster, right? It looks at computers a lot of the time and it says, we're just going to process more information, right? And we're going to process it faster. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't look at doing things differently. And different is hard, because if you're going to do something differently, it means you're probably going to have to stop, right? And I often like to say that the intelligence community loves the idea of disruptive innovation as long as it's not disruptive. Right? So as long as we can keep doing what we've always done, then we love that very notion of it. Another thing that I wanted to touch on a little bit, because this is a vital part of thinking about complexity, is our language. And I know language plays into the computer space a lot. I'm not an expert in this at all, but metaphor is a crucial issue for us. That we're dealing with, and you probably deal with it as well. You may not think about it in the same way, but almost all of the written metaphors, the linguistic metaphors that we use in the intelligence community are Newtonian mechanical metaphors. You'll see it embedded through the things that we write, and may well be embedded through the things that you do as well. Words like inertia, momentum, tension, leverage, trajectory. This is the vocabulary of Newtonian mechanics. It works really well for describing something that behaves in accordance with Newtonian mechanics, like a machine. This is a horrible metaphor for describing something that behaves organically, Now, a lot of times when I talk about this, people will say, oh, well, they're just figures of speech, right? Or they're just semantics. And I couldn't disagree with that anymore, right? And besides the fact that when somebody says to me that it's just semantics, it makes me up a crazy. Where the term, it just semantics became like meaning it doesn't mean anything. Semantics matter, right? This is important. But when people say to me that it's just figures of speech, they're wrong. The fact of the matter is metaphors are mental models. And if you have the wrong metaphor, you have the wrong mental model. And you are setting yourself, as well as anybody who reads that, up for surprise. So we have a true linguistic problem. I would imagine that you may as well, if you were to take a good hard scrub at some of the things that you write. But your metaphors actually conceptually shape how I would imagine you're going to write software and how you're going to think about the problems that you're trying to address. And these things are very interconnected and intertwined. So in the time I have left, what I want to just talk about a little bit is you really can't nibble at these problems, right? Because if you want to try to change cognition, then you need to try to change language. Right? And if you want to change cognition, you're going to have to bring into the picture visualization. These are things that are often, we want to, I'll do this one little bit over here or this over here. But you really can't without kind of taking the whole sandwich, right? So you're looking at sort of fundamental changes in who we are and what we do. But the problem with complexity is it breeds emergence. Right? And this is just that huge problem that we have. And emergence is sort of these surprising macro behaviors that sort of come out of all these little micro behaviors, even if we understand it. It's very, if not impossible to predict a lot of the time. But you can understand it and you can sort of anticipate it. There's a distinction between anticipation and prediction. So I'm not arguing that we should be able to predict anymore, that we should be able to predict how many hurricanes there are going to be, because weather is incredibly complex in any given year. But nonetheless, we can anticipate. We can know when conditions are ripe for certain kinds of weather patterns. And we can establish that over time, and we can have some sense. And I would argue that's one of the things that the intelligence community must indeed do. At the beginning, I'm going to wrap up here, but at the beginning of this, Lorianne had put up a slide. It may have been Feroz, but it was a whole list of some of the major challenges that we're dealing with as a species, right? As a planet, between climate change, economic contagion, wealth inequality, Russia, you name it, any one of these things. And if you think you're going to address these problems by old ways of thinking, you're simply not going to. These are classic examples of complexity, right? They require a really new way of thinking. Let me end with an interesting vignette that I hear a lot in the intelligence community. And this will sound weird to you, but one of the things that I hear a lot of analysts say to me is they say, "Thank God the Russians are back." Right? No, this is a real thing. They'll say, "Thank God the Russians are back." And I'll say, "What do you mean?" And they'll say, "Well, for the past 20 years, we've been dealing with really amorphous, terrorism, networked kinds of threats. These weren't the kinds of problems that we were created, as I talked about, to address. But Russia is a state, right? And we know how to do states." And I try to explain to them, and this is, because you're in a habit, but I try to explain to them, I say, look, if you think that you are going to deal with this Russia, right, by applying the lessons that you learned from the Soviet Union, you're deluding yourself, right? This Russia is an entirely different creature. It is completely embedded and enmeshed in the world in a way that the Soviet Union never was and was never going to be, right? So yes, you may have some kind of cultural understanding, and it may be the same in that sense. And we're seeing this, right? There's a domain, probably, and perhaps even the primary domain of warfare today that did not exist in 1985, right? This notion, of the cyber domain, it wasn't a concern then, right? We were a force-on-force, understand the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines, that kind of a construct. And And it brings you into sort of fundamental questions, like even about the Defense Department. Recently, I was in a discussion in the Pentagon, and I mentioned that if you were going to create a military today, would you really create a separate Army, Navy, and an Air Force and Marines? Would you do that? Right? They're just legacy constructs, right? And they're tied up, and they have a huge, a history and a proud culture, and I understand all of that. But when you're dealing, and this is why I would argue all of the services have all of the capabilities of the other services, right? The Army has its own Air Force, right? The Air Force has its own Army. The Navy has its own Army, right? And its own Air Force. The Marines have its own Air Force, right? And all of them are in cyber, right? As is everybody in cyber today, right? These are fundamental questions, and they go to the heart of complexity, right? Cyber as a domain that we have to deal in is a totally different creature. It's possible for a country with very limited traditional military force capability to be incredibly powerful in this complex, interconnected world in which we live in today. So I'm going to end on that note. I want to just reiterate this point about habit. We're creatures of habit. Habits are so strong, and when an organization has been very successful doing something, as I would argue the intelligence community has been, we've been very successful. It's really hard to change those habits, but the only way we're going to address these problems is by changing them. And that brings me back to that point about when I said these are not just the intelligence community's problems. It's not just our habits. They're your habits as well. And I think it's just something that we need to talk about. I hope that this event will allow us to talk about how we move into this realm of thinking differently about complexity. So should we do a Q&A, or are we out of time?